September 23rd, 1870. Paris, France. The Gare d'Austerlitz has been emptied of trains. Seamstresses from the garment district are working by gaslight, stitching panels of yellow silk together across the station floor. Carpenters are assembling wooden frames, lightweight, carefully jointed. A gas line from the La Villette Municipal Works has been extended across the city and routed into the building. The smell of varnish and coal gas is in the air. By morning, a balloon will rise above the Prussian siege lines carrying 200 kilograms of mail and 2 human beings, flying over an army that cannot shoot it down, cannot follow it, cannot stop it. I want to start there. Not with a theory, not with a conclusion. Just with that image. A railway station, built in 1840, functioning in 1870 as an aircraft manufacturing facility. On day 2 of a military crisis, with no new construction, no special equipment, no infrastructure that didn't already exist. That's what I keep coming back to. Not who built secret airports. That's the wrong question. The right question is quieter, and I think it's more unsettling. Why was 19th century civilization so immediately, effortlessly ready for aviation, before aviation, officially, existed? Here's what the historical record shows about the siege of Paris balloon mail network. This is not contested. This is documented at the Archives Nationales de France, cross-referenced in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France's Gallica collection, and corroborated by the photographer and aeronaut Nadar, whose full name was Gaspard Félix Tournachon, in his own memoir, Quand j'étais photographe, published in 1899. When Prussian forces surrounded Paris in September 1870, the French government faced a simple problem. No information could get out of the city, and no information could get in. The solution they reached for was not new technology. It was technology that already existed. Balloons had been publicly demonstrated in France since 1783. The chemistry of hydrogen gas production was industrial-grade standard by 1870. What Nadar and operational director Eugène Godard built was a system, and they built it inside the existing city, the Gare du Nord, the Gare d'Austerlitz. Both converted within days into balloon manufacturing workshops. The station's architecture required no modification to load-bearing structures. The ceiling heights, some exceeding 30 meters, accommodated the full inflation of large gas balloons inside. Municipal gas works at La Villette and Grenelle were connected directly to the launch facilities. Between September 23, 1870, and January 28, 1871, 67 confirmed flights, over 2 million letters transported, and on return flights, this is the detail that stops me, carrier pigeons were brought back into the city carrying microfilm dispatches. Documented as the earliest operational use of microfilm in communications. In 1870. I'm not claiming this proves anything hidden or suppressed. It's all in the archives. What I'm saying is, look at the logistics. A besieged city, under active military threat, stood up a functioning aerial mail network in days, using what was already there. The question mainstream aviation history never asks is, what does it mean that those buildings, the high clear-span ceilings, the connection to gas supply lines, the wide-open yards for inflation and launch, were already in place? That's not a fringe question. That's a logistics question. And if you work in logistics, if you understand systems, you know that it happened to fit perfectly is not a satisfying answer for a trained investigator. This raises a simple but critical question. What were those spaces designed for originally? Let me take you back further. 10 years earlier, different continent. August 1861, Thaddeus Sobieski Konstantin Low, that name is in the record. Record Group 94, U.S. National Archives, was appointed Chief Aeronaut of the Union Army Balloon Corps. What he built in the months that followed is something that aviation history textbooks mention briefly and move past quickly. I want to stay with it a little longer. Low didn't just launch balloons. He designed and deployed the world's first mobile hydrogen generation infrastructure. Iron retort wagons mounted on wheels, sulfuric acid reacting with iron filings to produce hydrogen gas. In the field, on demand, anywhere. Before Low's system, you could only inflate a military balloon near a fixed municipal gasworks. He cut that dependency entirely. And then, this is the part that gets underreported. The Union Army converted a coal barge, the George Washington Parke Custis, into what some historians describe as the functional equivalent of the first aircraft carrier in history. I want to be careful here. That framing is contested, and I'm not presenting it as settled fact. What isn't contested is what actually happened on that barge. Balloons were launched from it on the Potomac River. Telegraph wire was run from the gondola back to ground command, and real-time aerial intelligence was relayed to Union generals during active operations. Think about that system for a moment. Hydrogen fuel production, mobile and field deployable. A vessel modified for balloon launch and recovery. Telegraph communication linking aerial observation directly to command infrastructure. Trained ground crews operating in coordinated roles. That is not primitive ballooning. That is an integrated air operations system. It worked. The Balloon Corps was disbanded in 1863, not because it failed operationally. The National Archives record is clear. Low resigned over a pay dispute after repeated bureaucratic conflicts with the Army Signal Corps. The infrastructure, functional, tested, combat-proven, was not transferred, not preserved, not rebuilt. It was walked away from. And here's where the pattern starts to get uncomfortable. The technology worked in 1861. The infrastructure was deployable. The intelligence value was documented in Union military reports. Then, a paperwork dispute, a resignation, a disbanding, and the United States military would not operate a functional military air corps again for, depending on how you count, nearly 40 years. I'm not claiming someone suppressed it. I'm saying that is a strange institutional choice, and mainstream history doesn't linger on it. The official explanation, when it's given at all, is bureaucratic inertia. I find that explanation interesting and somewhat insufficient. If following that kind of evidence, the archive, the photograph, the gasworks connection, is useful to you, consider subscribing. I'm building a series that cites its sources, names its names, and asks the questions that don't have easy answers. That's the only version of this I'm interested in doing. Section 3, the Fleischberg, 1894. Now I want to show you something that I think is the sharpest single fact in this entire investigation. Berlin, Germany, summer of 1894. An engineer named Otto Lilienthal commissioned the construction of a 15-meter conical hill in the Lichterfelde district. It was built from brickwork slag, industrial waste, shaped into a precise mound. At the summit, a shelter for storing gliders. The hill was engineered with one very specific feature. You could launch a glider into the wind from any direction by simply walking to the appropriate side of the mound. Omnidirectional launch capability. Purpose-designed. Lilienthal performed over 2,000 documented flights from this structure. Contemporaneous photographs were taken by photographer Ottomar Anschutz. Not illustrations, not reconstructions, actual photographs, showing a human being in controlled flight, 9 years before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. Those photographs are held at the Otto Lilienthal Museum in Anklam, Germany, and in the DLR photo archive. The hill still exists. You can visit it today. It's called Lilienthal Park in Berlin-Lichterfelde. But here's the fact that I keep returning to. In a peer-reviewed academic chapter published by Springer Nature, I'm going to name the source because this matters. The Fliegerberg is examined as aviation infrastructure. The chapter's title is, and I'm quoting directly, "The Fliegerberg, a Real Airfield." A peer-reviewed publication used the word aerodrome for a structure that was built in 1894. The official starting line for aviation history is 1903. The Springer paper says there was a purpose-built aerodrome operating in Berlin 9 years before that line. This isn't a fringe claim. This isn't someone on a forum with a theory. This is a peer-reviewed academic chapter using precise terminology to describe what was, by modern definitional criteria, the world's first purpose-built aviation facility. And it is not in major aviation history textbooks. I want to be honest with you. I don't know why it isn't. I have a few possible explanations, none of them fully satisfying. One possibility is disciplinary. Aviation historians define aviation around powered, controlled, heavier-than-air flight. And by that definition, Lilienthal doesn't qualify. His gliders were unpowered. But that's a definitional choice. It's not a fact about what existed. The infrastructure existed. The flights happened. The photographs were taken. A peer-reviewed paper calls it a real airfield. The official starting line for when aviation began was drawn by institutions, not by the evidence. Once you see that, you start asking a different version of the question. Let me place these three things next to each other. 1861. The United States Army builds a mobile hydrogen-fueled air operations system, deploys it in combat, proves it works, and then dismantles it due to a pay dispute. 1870. A besieged French city converts its railway stations and municipal gasworks into a functioning aerial mail network in days, using infrastructure that required no modification. 1894. A private engineer builds a purpose-designed aerodrome in Berlin. A peer-reviewed academic paper calls it the first real airfield in history. It predates Kitty Hawk by 9 years. It is not in the textbooks. The pattern that emerges here is not about what was built. It's about what was already there. In 1861, the chemistry was already there. Industrial hydrogen production was a standard process. Lowe didn't invent it. He mobilized it. In 1870, the buildings were already there. The gasworks were already there. The high-span ceiling, the open yards, the gas connections, all pre-existing. In 1894, the industrial waste material was already there. The brickwork slag, the manufactured landscape of an industrial city. At every point, aviation did not require new infrastructure. It slotted into infrastructure that already existed as if it had always been designed for that purpose. Something was already built. Before I go further, what follows is less certain than what came before, and I want to be clear about where that line is. There is a community of researchers. They operate under different names, use different frameworks, who look at this pattern and reach a specific conclusion. That 19th century infrastructure was not simply well-suited to aviation by coincidence, but that it was designed by a civilization whose full technological capabilities are not reflected in the official historical record. Some call this framework the Old World. Some call it Tartaria. I'm not here to confirm that framework. I don't have the evidence to do that. What I'm here to say is, that framework is asking a genuinely interesting question. And the question it's asking is not crazy. If the infrastructure fit aviation perfectly before aviation officially existed, and the documented historical record shows that it did, then one of three things is true. Either it was coincidence, or 19th century industrial civilization was, in some functional sense, an aviation-capable civilization that simply hadn't synthesized its own capabilities yet. That's not a fringe position. That's the position you'd reach if you followed the archive evidence without adding anything to it. Or, and this is where the Tartaria framework lives, there's something in the prior history of that infrastructure that we don't have a complete account of. I don't know which of those is true. I know which one mainstream history picks by default, without examining the other two. Before we go further, I want to give you one more data point, because this one isn't speculative at all. The Smithsonian Institution is the official keeper of American aviation history. The 1903 Wright Flyer is their centerpiece. They are the institutional authority on the question of who flew first. In 1914, 11 years after Kitty Hawk, the Smithsonian allowed aviator Glenn Curtiss to take Samuel Langley's original 1903 aerodrome, modify it significantly, fly it briefly over a lake, and then return the machine to museum display labeled, and I'm quoting the label, "The first man-carrying aeroplane in the history of the world, capable of sustained free flight." That label stood in the Smithsonian until 1942. Orville Wright, in direct protest over this misrepresentation, refused to donate the original 1903 flyer to the Smithsonian. He sent it to the Science Museum in London instead, where it remained for 45 years. This is documented by Dr. Tom Crouch, senior curator of the Smithsonian's own National Air and Space Museum, in his book The Bishop's Boys, published by W. W. Norton in 1989. It is documented by James Hansen in First Flight, published in 2003. The Smithsonian signed a formal agreement with the Wright estate in 1948 acknowledging the error. The nation's official keeper of aviation history falsified the central record in that history, in a museum display, visible to every visitor, for nearly 30 years, and then corrected it quietly. Let me be careful about what this actually shows. It doesn't tell us that a vast conspiracy suppressed pre-Wright aviation. I'm not claiming that. What it tells us is institutional records about aviation history have been demonstrably documented, formally incorrect before. And the correction came slowly, reluctantly, and only under sustained private pressure from the person who was there. This raises a simple but critical question. If the Smithsonian misrepresented the most famous flight in history for 3 decades, what's the appropriate level of deference we should grant to the same institution's framing of what existed before? I don't think none is the right answer. The Smithsonian does serious scholarship. I also don't think complete is the right answer. The official explanation collapses here, not into conspiracy, but into something quieter and harder to dismiss. The institution got it wrong, knew it was wrong, and took 30 years and a private estate dispute to correct it. Let me go back to the Gare d'Austerlitz. September 23, 1870. The seamstresses, the yellow silk, the gas line from La Villette. What I keep coming back to is not the balloon, it's the building. The Gare d'Austerlitz was completed in 1840, 30 years before the siege. The ceiling heights that made it immediately functional as a balloon factory were not added in 1870. The access to municipal gas infrastructure was not installed during the crisis. The wide open approach yards, the structural spans, the layout, all of it was there. Mainstream history's answer is, wartime improvisation is creative, and people use what's available. That's true. and I believe it. But people use what's available is only part of the sentence. The other part is, what was available was perfectly suited, across multiple independent cities and decades, for a technology that, officially, didn't exist yet. I don't have a clean answer for that. The Tartaria researchers have one. I've told you what it is. I've also told you I can't confirm it, and I won't pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is that the archives are real. The photographs are real. The peer-reviewed paper calling the Fliegerberg a real airfield is real. The Smithsonian's 1948 correction is real. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. 1861, 1870, 1894, and the official story starts in 1903. Something was already built. Whether that infrastructure was erased from the record, or just quietly unclassified as irrelevant once the official story was set, I don't know. But something was already built. And then the story started in 1903. The question that I can't stop asking is, for what?